Good afternoon, all. Of course, this is Mr. Lambert. Thank you all for coming and being a part of this. But the reason I'm here today is I wanted to give a presentation on FERPA and how we all can become familiar with it and know our rights as a school, our rights as teachers, and how these protections come into place for students and parents. So, with that, let me go ahead and get started. First of all, you might want to be wondering, what is FERPA? So we asked ourselves, FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It's a federal law that protects the confidentiality of student records and information. It applies to all schools that receive government funding, which so you can be aware that that encompasses almost every public school, I'm sure, in the nation. The parents are granted rights on behalf of their children. When the child turns 18, the rights transfer to that student, so this will follow them into a higher ed type of learning. Parents and adult age students, they have a right to receive records, and it also gives the school a right to deny others outside the school system to have access to those student educational records. So let's talk a little bit about the data with FERPA and student data and its relation to each other. First of all, there's been further calls to FERPA enforcement and a little gray area in what should be covered, what should not be covered. Ransomware attacks have led to further calls for FERPA enforcement. Some advocates are calling for FERPA to be strengthened to include that ransomware and data theft. The question in many of the articles that I researched was, are we up to date? Are we up to date with, technology and everything to that effect in its relation to FERPA? FERPA has become out of touch with modern classrooms in the digital age. That came from one article that we read. In the event of an epidemic disease or school shooting, data sharing needs to be readdressed. What can we, in case of emergency, what protects us in that, in disclosing information that needs to be disclosed for it to be a safe type of environment? And again, like I said at the very end, when it comes to health and safety of a school may disclose any information that pertains to the issue and it is relevant. So this is something that was brought in there as a better clause that helps us even more. This is a continuous on student data and its relation. I want to talk about the destruction of data and how we should erase the data, and there's 3 ways to do that. First of all, I want to talk about the data life cycle. You capture the data, you organize it, utilize it, manage the data, and then finally destroy. And there's 3 destruction categories that we need to be cognizant of. You can clear the data. That, of course, is clearing it, rewriting it, making sure it's software-based. Purge the data using state-of-the-art laboratory procedures to make the data unable to be recovered. Destroy the data. This is the inability to use any type of media for storage for data. This could be in the form of shredding or anything to that effect. Let's talk about FERPA and surveillance cameras. Surveillance cameras and the relationship to FERPA, when a photo is directly related to the student and maintained by the educational system, FERPA applies. However, we need to consider 4 elements here. Is the recording used for disciplinary purposes? Is the student violating the law or getting injured? Are they photos for IDs, school IDs, lunch cards, anything to that effect? And does it contain identifiable information from a student's record? So we need to consider all those things when we're looking at surveillance cameras. Fox states a recording will not be considered directly related to a student when a student's image is simply incidental to the activity depicted in the recording, or when a student is shown participating in a school activities open to the public and the recording does not focus on any specific focus student. Now we'll turn the tide a little bit and look at FERPA and school resource officers and law enforcement. What is this relation here? First of all, law enforcement can be considered school officials if they perform a function or service that the school would use employees for. Are they under the control of the school district? Are they subject to FERPA disclosure requirements? Do they meet the school's criteria for FERPA requirements? And any health or safety emergency in which law enforcement personnel are involved and a student is involved constitutes FERPA compliance. So this is very important that, if there's a health, safety, any type of emergency, those law enforcement they can be FERPA compliant in that way. First of all, not first of all, let me add that secondly, I want to talk about the immigration and undocumented. In one article that I researched, it talked about ICE, coming to the school. Can they have that information? Without a subpoena, student records cannot be released. We are not required to report undocumented students, and undocumented students have the same right to a free public education. Finally, what schools can do to maintain FERPA compliance? Number one, vendors. Let's look at our vendors and ensure that they have safety measures in place at all times. Make the contracts that we hold with our vendors be liable, and be very careful of online vendors. Apps, anything like that. Make sure they're not selling that student information to other carriers. Two, withholding and releasing records. We must be aware that parents own the FERPA rights until the child is 18, and when the child turns 18, the rights are transferred to them. When should we hold them? When should we release the records? That is something we need to be aware of. And number three, exercise caution when speaking of situations. You cannot read a report to the public about a fight or incident. Once it becomes a report, that is an educational record. If it was a teacher just talking about witnessing a fight without a report being made, that's different, but you cannot read the report. Be cognizant of social media, no names mentioned. Be very careful when you do post anything on social media, which we shouldn't be sharing any kind of students' information or talking about them on social media in any way. And you can share information about a student's status with counselors or mental health individuals, which of course that's why we're all here to help students. So we can share that without being incompliant with FERPA. And how to ensure compliance. So number one, let's raise FERPA awareness and train our employees. That should be the number one criteria. Number two, confirm that FERPA applies to you. Number three, know the rights, protections, and exceptions. So let's look at FERPA and know the rights we have, the protections we have, the protections parents have, the rights parents and students have, and the exceptions to those rights. Number four, again, we've talked about vendors, but let's choose compliant vendors. Number five, implement compliance procedures and prevention tools. And finally, number six, encrypt files and emails. I thank you all for listening. I hope you learned a lot in this presentation about what FERPA is. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I would like to end with sharing with all of you the references that I utilized in this presentation. Thank you very much.